Fergus, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's great to see you. I'm so excited to talk with you.
It's my honor. I'm eager to take on this topic, which I guess you'll introduce. Yeah.
I want to start with your feelings about the Canadian election results. Were you disappointed that Canadians decided to re-elect the Liberal Party?
No, not really. I mean, I got to be frank. I would never vote for the party, but I expected this to happen. And since I'm less interested in tinkering around the edges, and I see Canada as structurally broken, I didn't really see a great deal of change either way in terms of the Conservatives or Liberals. And in many ways, I was happy to see that this was a catalyst for people to realize that there's a structural problem here, that the population centers around Ontario, around Toronto and Montreal basically decide the election, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's been like that forever, and it made me mad back when, my family were avid NDP supporters because we didn't like the Liberal Party for, a different reason. But you're right. Ontario essentially controls what happens in Canada, and it's not fair. So, I mean, I think one of the positive outcomes of this election for me was that, I'm hoping that there will be a bigger conversation about Alberta separation and, the viability of Canada economically in general. I wonder if you could talk about that. I mean, how strong is the Canadian economy?
Right. So the Canadian economy is in a terrible situation, and Canada is on a path to basically Argentina-like status, right? Where it's not often that a country goes backwards and loses first world status, right? Argentina is one such country that a century ago was up among the most wealthy per capita in the world, right? And Canada is going through that process right now. Now, it takes a generation or two to really achieve such a feat, but Canada is on path to that, where capital per worker is declining, where GDP per capita has basically been stagnant for the last, almost since the global financial crisis. So Canada's in a terribly weak position. Further, if Canada were in the middle of Europe, maybe she would be more competitive. But because you have a more dynamic neighbor right next door, that creates all sorts of problematic incentives. You attract the worst kind of immigrants while pushing away the best people, including your native-born population, right? Yeah, so I'm a Canadian citizen, and I live in the United States, where I could move back any time. But after business school, I decided that I had better prospects here.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is the case for lots of people. You wrote that Canada's population in 2021 grew almost twice as fast as other G7 nations to reach 37 million, with another 1.3 million slated for the next 3 years. What happened there? I mean, is this sustainable? How is this going to impact Canadians?
Yeah, so that population growth. Now, I'm not sure. Are you quoting from my book there? I can't.
I'm quoting from your book. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So that has been a push now among both parties, really, to try to capture an immigrant voter bloc. And Stephen Harper was so afraid to challenge the mass immigration into Canada that he basically went along with it. So there's been huge immigration into Canada, so not a great deal of native-born population growth. And that is just rapidly changing the nature of the society. Now, probably not out in places like PEI and Newfoundland, but broadly speaking, Canada is becoming a different country. And it is losing its pioneer heartland culture. And I suspect that many people who've been living away from Canada for, let's say, for a couple of decades would go back and hardly recognize many parts of the country. Vancouver is a great example.
Yeah, I mean, Vancouver is, even when I'm away for 6 months or a year, I go back and it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
What happened to my neighborhood?
Well, I went to Vancouver as a child. So I grew up in New Zealand, but my mother was Canadian. And she took me when I was, I think, 11 years old. So this is back in the 1990s to see Victoria, Vancouver. We drove through the Rockies up to Calgary, where she had grown up. And I just thought Canada was the most beautiful country ever. I just could not believe it. And at the time, Vancouver was such a pleasant, impressive city. And so I've seen this rapid, let's say, strong change in I guess 30 odd years, a short period of time. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I mean, yeah, I was born and raised in Vancouver, so I grew up there in the 90s, and it was a great city. It was a really great city to grow up in. It was super safe. I mean, we really literally just kind of roamed the streets on our own as kids and rode our bikes down to
Yeah.
the beach, and it was, it was nice because it was like a small city, but it still had city things, and of course very beautiful. And it's not the case anymore. I mean, it doesn't feel safe at all. It feels very dangerous. The addiction problem is totally out of control. And yeah, it seems like most people, the neighborhoods have all really been destroyed. It's totally unaffordable, completely unaffordable. I couldn't afford to live
Yeah.
there, even if I wanted to move back, which I do not. I don't think I could do it, to be honest. But I guess I want to talk about some of the less economically viable provinces. There's places in Canada like New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island that are not economically viable. How are these provinces surviving? Is that sustainable?
Oh, it's a great question. So I was fortunate after college to get a job out in Halifax and was working for a think tank there at the time. So it gave me a strong feel for the province. And my uncle still lives in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and he's my godfather, so we're close. And it is a fact that there's a very peculiar culture in the Maritimes where the private sector is really depressed. And that means that people really revere and admire government employment. It's kind of like this high status thing to have a government job, which to me is crazy, but right, that's the way the society thinks. And also because so much of the quote unquote private sector is really just dependent on subsidies or handouts, they don't really have an independent voice anymore, right? They cannot critique the government so much. And that think tank I work for is basically folded up now. So it no longer exists. It no longer exists in its previous form. So what's the future? I mean, if you were to actually take away the employment insurance system, the redistribution equalization system, you would really have a hollowing out. I mean, the impetus to open up those economies to new industry would be huge. So it's really a tragedy to me because it is a beautiful part of Canada, right? And it has a great deal of history, but economically, that part of Canada has just struggled to innovate or really move beyond, I guess, what they used to have fisheries. They don't really have that anymore. So what is left? It's hard to say. Some tourism, some higher education. It's an extremely limited part of the country.
And how does that work? Like, where is the money coming from to sustain these provinces that aren't producing?
Yeah, so these provinces characterize themselves as have-not provinces. And I remember, so I went to one of these, I think it was called the Manning Center Networking Conference. There used to be this big conservative conference every year, and they still have it up in, I think, Ottawa. And I went to this years ago, and I was chatting with one of the more conservative-leaning members of parliament from the Maritimes, and I said, and we were discussing what exactly does the Conservative Party stand for. And I said, can we just agree limited government is something that the Conservative Party stands for? And he actually said no, because in the Maritimes we depend so much on redistribution that that they as a conservative, he would actually push for protecting or preserving these programs. So how does it work? I don't actually know the finer details of the formula. This is a complicated topic, but it is a massive amount. So it comes in Nova Scotia to about $3,000 Canadian per capita is taken from basically the prairie provinces and somewhat a little bit from Ontario and given to these to Nova Scotia. And I think it's similar in the other Maritime provinces or Atlantic Canada. And in Quebec, I think it's around 1,300 per capita. So it's quite a substantial magnitude, especially if you consider how this adds up over time.
Yeah. So you wrote about what I had not heard this term before, but Wexit in your
Yes.
book. So that would be the separation of the Western provinces. I have a bunch of questions about this, but one of my first questions was that I just don't see BC leaving. Like I can see why Alberta should separate, and I think Alberta should separate. I think that it would be better for Alberta for sure. And then that maybe, you know, Saskatchewan would follow, but BC is still voting NDP, and I don't know that they would be on board. What do you think?
Right. Well, I lived for a short period of time in Victoria, BC, and I'm very familiar with the, I don't know, crunchy hipster culture, if you can call it that, of coastal BC. Now, the book is financial sovereignty for Canadians, Untether Yourself from the Ottawa Leviathan, and I sought to really give Canadians options for taking personal action to to extract themselves from Ottawa, whether it's leaving the country or using cryptocurrencies or using private or censorship-resistant platforms. Now, in the epilogue, I thought I could add a bit more flair and say, well, the real untethering would be just a whole province to leave, right? Now, I know that you would get probably, I don't know, 5% of the British Columbia population voting to secede from Canada right now. And you'd probably get 35, maybe even 40% right now in Alberta, right? So it's given the latest impetus, who knows? But my sense is that if Alberta were to leave Canada, the country would nigh be over, in that it would be fiscally unsustainable, even less than it is right now, right? So, or even more unsustainable than it is right now. And how that would finish up, I'm really not sure. It's just clear that Canada has become so dependent on Alberta's revenues that she would not know how to handle living without it. And so if Alberta were to leave, and I'm optimistic, I don't think it'll happen next year, but within the next decade or so, I think it will happen. That would, in my opinion, be the end of Quebec's presence in Canada, because there'd no longer be bribes or subsidies to keep them in. And then once that happened, you have such a fragmented country. I'm thinking, why would you even have Canada together? It wouldn't make a lot of sense, because Ottawa is so far from Vancouver. And so maybe Vancouver would want to just be its own country too. I don't know. But Wexit is just a broad term referring to the departure of the Western provinces. It doesn't maybe Manitoba would want to stay in, maybe BC would too, but predictably Alberta would go first. And there's a strong view that Saskatchewan would join Alberta, and that would make maybe a new country called Buffalo. Yeah.
Cool. I'd love to see it. I'm curious to know exactly how that would work, though. I mean, is it so you would hold Alberta's talking about holding a referendum. Danielle Smith has just made it easier to hold a referendum. And then what? I mean, is it possible that the Canadian government could just say, no, you can't leave? I mean, I just saw a clip from one of the Indigenous chiefs saying that, you can't go, we own this land essentially, which, what did she say? If they're not happy living in this country, anybody who wants to separate, the premier included, they can gladly go live in any other country they wish around the world, but they will not be taking any treaty or inherent lands away with them. So can Indigenous people sort of hold provinces hostage on account of reserve land?
Yeah, so Megan, I'm really glad you brought this up because these sort of silly arguments are everywhere. And there's so many responses to them. So first, Canada obviously has decentralized away from the United Kingdom, right? We're not represented by the British Parliament. And is that evil? Is that unpatriotic? And and also, it wasn't as though the area now known as Alberta was voluntarily annexed to Canada. It was forcefully annexed. So it wasn't like all the Albertans at the time said, let's have a vote and join Canada, right? It didn't happen like that. So and I just don't, I mean, in many ways, it's a bit of a tragedy that as you get older, we become a bit more cynical, maybe,
It's
and you
happened to
see,
me.
and so you see that the people who resist things like Alberta separation or independence tend to be those who receive the most subsidies from the federal government,
Mm.
right? Yeah. So it's not an accident that Edmonton, right, where there is the political class of people, they're most opposed to it. And we know that there's this indigenous industry now, unfortunately, this kind of victim industry where not everyone who claims First Nation status gets this, but the higher ups, they do. They're dependent. They've been bought off basically de facto through the welfare system that's provided to them. And so they're probably concerned that Albertans won't be so easily manipulable to that sort of guilt shaming that supposedly they have to just pay reparations forever, basically.
Right.
So I just think that in Canada, everyone gets a vote. You don't get more votes because you're First Nation, First Nation status. And within Alberta, there'll be a referendum in the next few years. And First Nation people who are also Canadian citizens can get a vote too. Now, like I said, my sense is many of them have enjoyed preferential treatment from Ottawa as a way to make them more subservient, and maybe they're afraid of getting just equal treatment before the law or under the law in an independent Alberta. But then they can get a vote. I mean, that's one of the real tragedies that Ottawa has bought off various constituencies, including industry, higher education, now the media, and so these various sectors are afraid to bite the hand that feeds them. It's really a
Mhm.
tragedy. It's so destructive to intellectual integrity.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I just think that if Canada does remain a country, which I mean,
Mm,
I think that what you're saying does make sense, which is that if Alberta leaves and then maybe Saskatchewan leaves, maybe Quebec leaves, I mean, what would be the point of Canada and how would they manage to sustain themselves and function as a country after that?
mm,
Um, but what I sort of saw maybe happening was that, we continue to import millions and millions and millions of immigrants in. Um, they can provide cheaper labor than Canadian-born Canadians can. So all
yeah.
these people are losing their jobs to these immigrants. And then everyone kind of depends on the government. I mean, I think already something like there's like I think like almost half of Canadians or something like that have government
Yeah.
jobs, who work for the city or the province or the federal government in one way or another. And that's a lot. And it's, of course, a big voting block as well. You're probably not going to
Absolutely.
vote against yourself and your job. You're not, like you said, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. But I just don't know where all that money comes from.
Well, yeah. So I should respond more about in terms of the process, right? My personal view, and it is a view shared by Michael Wagner, the author of this book, No Other Option, right? It's just about leaving Canada, is that you don't need any kind of permission or approval from Ottawa. You can just do it yourself, which is what Quebec planned to do back in the 90s with the 1995 referendum, with which they came very close, right?
Mhm.
However, after that, I think Ottawa, they became concerned about it. and put a process in place. So it's called the Clarity Act. So on the one hand, they affirmed that it is completely legal or constitutional for provinces to secede from Canada. On the other, they put some stumbling blocks, which I guess most separatists have accepted now, that there has to be some kind of a negotiation with Ottawa, and how that would proceed, it's really an unknown because it hasn't happened yet. But in terms of people being bought off, this is just, it breaks my heart to see how, and I have friends who are stuck in the situation, how so many Canadians are dependent on government, and they basically are afraid because they know if they had to get a real job, their salaries or benefits would go down tremendously. So they really have become stuck in their roles. And it's a bit like asking people who are dependent on the welfare state or on government employment, it's a bit like ever expecting government or public school teachers to be libertarian. It just is never going to happen, right? Because they are dependent. They're basically working for this entity that they have, I guess, positive feelings towards, and they are not going to vote against their own self-interest, right? Now, this is a problem too, because as you said, immigrants tend to move to the cities, and they typically do not have the heartland, rugged individualist mentality of native Albertans. So if you were to remove Calgary and definitely Edmonton, you'd have separatism tomorrow, basically, right? All the rural Albertans would support it right away. You are stuck with now these urban populations that don't reflect traditional Alberta. And this is an issue that is especially sensitive to me because I'm of the pioneer stock, similar British pioneer stock in New Zealand, and my mother's family were not, I don't know, pioneers, but of immigrants from generations ago to Alberta. So there is a particular culture. I mean, what's the point of separating and having independent Alberta unless it is distinct? And of course it is distinct. Alberta is distinct, but that distinctiveness is diluted with time the more you have immigrants go there. And unfortunately, I suspect politicians, it's almost like CEOs wanting to grow their companies. Politicians want to feel more powerful and have a bigger population under them. And I would caution people that you don't want to dilute the very distinctiveness that makes Alberta worth separating for.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the city problem is sort of a problem in general. I think even in America too, but for sure in Canada. I mean, it's this, BC, like I said, BC voted NDP, but that's mostly because of Vancouver and Victoria. A lot of the more rural areas in BC did vote Conservative, and the Conservative Party did really, really well in BC for the first time in as long as I can remember, in any case. So yeah, we end up feeling sort of held hostage by these urban progressives and who have no contact with anybody outside their little urban progressive bubble. Also, they seem completely unaware that anybody else lives anywhere else in the province. They have no idea what anybody thinks or believes. It's very frustrating. I'm talking about all my old Vancouver friends, really.
Sure.
Yeah. But sorry, go ahead.
No. Well, so on the one hand, though, I want to promote the, let's say, decentralization or sovereignty for Alberta and the Western provinces, not only based on, let's say, resentment or antagonism towards Ottawa, but on the opportunity. My personal belief is that, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, likely in the same fashion, could be the most advanced or sophisticated modern economy in the world. That the accountability, the populace, the right size of about 5 million people could really lead the world. And especially since you'll be starting from scratch, there'd be a great deal more transparency. I just think it's a wonderful opportunity. One of the challenges we have is that when you live on the internet, you find people who are like-minded and they really get you excited. But then when you go on the ground in Alberta, you realize that most Albertans are not so intense like you and I are. So,
They aren't on
so
X as much as we are.
they're not. No, it's very exciting or thrilling, really, to consider this prospect, because I just think it would be a wonderful development. And I'm not a big advocate for U.S. statehood, even though I realize that many people and many provinces would see themselves as better off as a part of the United States versus being a part of Canada.
Yeah, it was funny to me the amount of people who were behaving as though Canada becoming a part of the US was an attack on Canada and was this dangerous threat. And I was like, you guys would be much better off as part of America. They have an incredibly strong economy and military. You'd have more individual rights, more free speech. And it makes me wonder what Canadians think they're holding on to.
It's look, Canadian national identity is such a nebulous, I don't know, a concept, right? And in my view, it basically it almost doesn't exist at this point, right? And all these Team Canada people who've come out of the woodwork lately, I find it so shallow or weak, because we all know that Trudeau had said that Canada lacked any coherent national identity. And now suddenly they turn around a couple of years later and say, yeah, Team Canada. I'm going, what is this Team Canada? You don't even know. And tragically, so much of Canadian identity is basically an anti-identity. It's not being American. It's a bit embarrassing to me that you would define yourself on what you are not in terms of this evil American, southern neighbor. And the truth is that Canada just it has regional identities that do make sense, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's why it would be much more natural. So Atlantic Canada, for example, to me, or how New Brunswick would fit is a bit more complicated, but does have a coherent community where, you can go between and feel like you're part of the same place. But of course, by moving between Quebec and Alberta, it's ridiculous. You're not the same place at all. It's not the same society.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know. It was.
And Canada did not start off like the United States with a clear, let's say, mission statement of the Declaration of Independence. Canada just doesn't have that. The US has both let's say, a founding stock of pioneer people, which are largely British settlers, and then it has a mission statement of, well, not only are we a certain people, we have certain values that we really revere or hold up high, these natural rights. And I wish Canada had more of that, but it does not. And trying to impose a national identity now, it seems like it's too late.
Right. And I still really can't figure out what it is. Like, is it hockey? Is it somebody on Twitter told me it was like hockey and maple syrup? And I was like, I can't remember the last time I've even looked at a bottle of maple syrup, maybe when I was a kid. I was like, that's not really a cultural identity. Like, I don't watch hockey either. I know the Canadians like hockey, but it can't just be hockey and maple syrup.
Yeah, I mean, I do love maple syrup. I got to be honest; it tastes delicious. But and it is very confusing, because you think, well, there are all these Canadian content requirements. There are all these subsidies for Canadian artists or producers or whatever. And you think, what exactly are we subsidizing? I don't get it. It just seems like a gravy train for people who can't compete with the Americans.
For sure. I mean, this is why Canadian art or, Canadian music, Canadian movies and TVs are so bad, because it can't sustain itself. So it's all totally dependent on government grants, and the government provides grants to bad art, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think the two most successful Canadian movies were My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was solid.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't know that was Canadian.
Yeah, and then there's some kind of like really, I don't know, how can I say, like a silly comedy from back in the 80s. But it is weird. And then Buffy St. Clair was basically the most prominent, quote unquote, Indigenous artist. But of course, that was a sham. She was actually American, from Massachusetts, I think. So.
And maybe not Indigenous?
She's not Indigenous at all. It's really
Yeah,
sad. The whole story, how she
but
basically just like,
hilarious.
well, the
Sorry.
pretendian scenario is going to grow more, or has grown, as the benefits, or let's say the unequal treatment gives favorability to being First Nation. More people will want to pretend. Let's say you're 5% Native American or First Nation and 95% something else. Well, you'll identify as First Nation because you'll get preferential treatment for that.
Yeah, and money.
Yeah. So I just, like I said, I personally, and it's awkward for me to say, I guess, because I did grow up in New Zealand. I'm a Canadian citizen. I've lived there, but I haven't been so deep in the culture like, let's say, my cousins are. But I don't really see why you'd want to be associated with Ottawa, because the best parts of Canada have nothing to do with the central government of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, Ottawa has never appealed much to me, and I can't imagine who it would appeal to. Obviously, perhaps if you're a politician.
Right.
Where do you think that where do you think that Mark Carney wants to take Canada? What do you think his sort of overarching goals are for Canada?
Right. Well, he is. So first, he's an intelligent man. So let's give some credit where credit is due. He has worked hard and had success in the economic and financial fields, right? So, but where does he want to take this? He does have a strong social engineering proclivity, right? So he does see himself as a social engineer, and he obviously has a strong environmentalist inclination, also a redistributionist instinct. So I guess he would also want to see some success, right? So he wants to see that he has a positive legacy. So not all politicians are just as incompetent as his predecessor. Even if they have a different ideology, they want to see themselves as successful. So he will actually, I'm optimistic that in some ways he could have some benefits. So he has spoken positively about moving swiftly to remove interprovincial barriers to trade, right? So he's not completely, let's say, economically illiterate at all. He does understand economics. It's just that he's kind of at war between his economic knowledge or understanding and his social engineering tendencies, right? So these are at odds with each other. And in some areas, he may do good. In other areas, he will really just compound the problems of Canada's current status.
Do you think that the healthcare system is viable as it's currently functioning?
I don't. And I don't. This is where I don't understand why Canadians are so wedded to this idea that they think they're so morally superior because they have quote unquote universal medical care, when we all know it's junk and that there are huge waiting lists. It's a big disaster. When I broke my arm up in Canada, up in Calgary, you have to, I think, call in, and they'll try to persuade you not to go to the hospital because they don't want to have everyone lining up there. But they said, well, actually, you've probably broken your arm, so you should come down here. But then you wait for hours in the waiting room to have someone come and talk to you, right? And so there's this strong egalitarian streak in Canada, and we have it in New Zealand too, where we don't like to see some people have more than others, but that's freedom. Some people are going to fail in life and make bad decisions, and some people are going to be more successful, save, and get better quality. And the thing is that this low quality medical system is really lowering the, let's say, standard of living for Canadians. So if you want to have quality, it has to be consumer directed and not directed by politicians, right? So right now, I mean, one of my cousins is a cardiologist out in Quebec, and she just says how the money being wasted is ridiculous. That people will come in and just break the machines, and there's no accountability because they're not the ones paying for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because I feel, I haven't felt optimistic about Canada in quite a long time now. I did when the
Yeah.
convoy came along. That was the first
Mm.
kind of inspiring thing I'd seen come out of Canada in many, many years. It was very thrilling to me and touching.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I'm like, I feel optimistic about Canada in terms of the end of Canada. What I see the future of Canada being, I'm like, what I think would be best for Canada really would be separation or a dissolution of Canada, certainly as we know it today. And I hope that other Canadians sort of come around to this view.
And I'm right with you, because a separation would help preserve the very best of Canada, but remove the parasitic entity that is destroying the area we know as Canada today. I mean, I go to Quebec, for example, even though I think Quebec should be its own country. I think they have beautiful cuisine, beautiful architecture. I ran the marathon in Quebec City years ago and thought this is a lovely place. And I just think they're not growing up. They became this kept child of Ottawa, and it's really weakened them. And so, in the same way, the real pioneer spirit that can give Canadians pride is also being weakened by this, nanny or welfare state, and it could be reinvigorated. So the best of Canada would be realized or protected. It's kind of like in the United States, where the Declaration of Independence wasn't really a revolution. The founders of the United States really wanted to restore or protect what they saw as the best of the British world, and remove themselves from what they saw as a tyrannical monarch.
Right. Well, your book, again, of course, is called Financial Sovereignty for Canadians, Untether Yourself from the Ottawa Leviathan. Where else can people find you and your work?
Well, much like you, I am addicted to X or Twitter, and
so fun.
Love it. Yes. So get on there at Fergus Hodgson. Otherwise, I am learning like you. I mean, you've really crushed on Substack. I'm learning the Substack ecosystem, and I will be doing more there. So I have basically a geopolitical project called the Impunity Observer. That's just impunityobserver.com. And then I have my own financial interests, which is Econ Americas, and it's on Substack, econamericas.substack.com.
Okay, excellent. I'm so glad that we were able to connect, and I'm so glad we were able to talk about all this. Thank you so much. It was great to see you again.
Likewise, Megan, keep up the great work in Mexico, and I'd love to come back on another time.
Of course, I'd love that too. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.